in planning, we've been doing a comprehensive planning effort for about a year and a half called The Big Picture. Though I know you are all familiar with The Big Picture. You all get our newsletter. You all visit our website regularly, so I don't have to go, there you go. I don't have to go into too much detail on that. But as part of it, we've been having a series of speakers and events come out and kind of talk to us about trends in development, ideas for growth and quality of life, and I think we've got a real treat tonight. I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing a fellow Georgia Tech College of Architecture alum. We're in Huntsville. Are there any other Georgia Tech people out there? I mean, come on, there we go. Thank you, Dave. So we've got some other Georgia Tech folks. If you're familiar with Georgia Tech, it's a fairly rigorous program. You will stay up nights. You will definitely earn your degree by the time you're done with it. But as part of the architecture program, you're expected to finish a thesis at the end of it. And the thesis, you're really encouraged to kind of think big, be visionary, look at some of the, whatever it is, if you could do or build anything, do that. And you had a lot of folks, people did museums of Southern culture or giant transit stations, in my case, a baseball park. And whenever you're doing them, you have this tendency, I think every architecture student has that tendency when they're doing it, to think in the back of their mind, wouldn't it be cool if this actually happened, if it weren't just a thesis, if it were actually realized? And you could probably actually forgive Ryan Gravel for not thinking that, because even in the realm of crazy, wild ideas, really visionary, big ideas, the Atlanta BeltLine is even off the spectrum. When you think of taking 20 plus miles of underutilized, or in some cases active rail line, abandoned industrial land, and turning it into greenways and parks and transit and development that really built a character to a community, you could probably forgive him if he wasn't even optimistic about that. But he had cause to be, because if you go there now and you see the way it's being built out, it's spectacular, and it's a testament to vision. And I want us all, as we're listening to this tonight, to really keep that in mind. We're a community that can take a crazy idea and actually realize it. We helped put a couple of folks in a tin can and shoot it off the planet and bring them back alive. So, if we can do that kind of crazy, we can do really any kind of crazy. So really think about when we have a vision for what the future of our city wants to be, what we want to see it grow into. There isn't any crazy too crazy, really. We can do it. And Ryan's going to talk tonight about how it's being done in other places and what we can actually learn from that. So please join me in welcoming Ryan Gravel.
Thanks. This is the Atlanta BeltLine project, at least part of it. Has anybody been there yet that's here too? I can kind of see a few hands. Good. We're going to talk about that tonight, but this is the beginning of a much larger transformation that you'll hear about. We're only in the early stages of implementation. It used to look like this. An abandoned railroad corridor was my graduate thesis in 1999. I did a joint degree at Georgia Tech with city planning and architecture, and the BeltLine was this idea. And again, who knew that we would actually build it, that it would actually come to life? Certainly not me. I just wanted to graduate, and which I did. And so you'll sort of see part of how that story panned out. But first we're going to talk about change generally, so we're going to step back, way back a little bit, before we talk about the BeltLine, and talk about change and how cities change, and especially around the role of infrastructure. Then we'll dive into some more specifics about the Atlanta BeltLine itself. Then we'll talk about projects like the Atlanta BeltLine that are popping up and emerging in cities all around the world. And then we're going to talk about some lessons from that, and then talk about what all this means and why it matters, which of course is why we do planning anyway, because to make the world a better place. So we'll talk about that. So we're going to start with change and how places like this change. When I graduated, did my undergraduate at Georgia Tech too in architecture, and Atlanta at that time sort of looked like this. It had stabilized after a couple of decades of losing population. We lost a fifth of our population in the 70s and 80s. By the late 90s, the city had sort of stabilized and was starting to grow again, But left behind, sort of the onslaught of the 20th century, was a lot of abandoned land, a lot of neighborhoods that needed a lot of revitalization, and so that was sort of the world. And you know, I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta. I didn't know the city, but really became fascinated with urban neighborhoods and urban conditions and challenges and opportunities in the face of this sort of change where the city was now starting to grow again. And Atlanta's a railroad town. That's why the city exists. It's the railroad junction, and there are railroads kind of everywhere. And they have this kind of adventurous quality where they go these sort of secret places. It's kind of fun. Maybe more importantly, I did a year abroad in Paris when I was in college, and it really changed the way that I saw the world. Within about 2 months, I had lost 15 pounds. I was in the best shape of my life because I was eating fresh food and I was walking wherever I went. And it really got me thinking about the relationship between our built environment, the places that we live, and our personal health and well-being. It became really crystal clear. And I became really obsessed beyond architecture about the foundation and the form of the city and how the form of the city really shapes the way that we live. And so that really coalesced around infrastructure. That's me. My cousin Leanne remembers me. She mentioned this picture earlier today, and I said, well, surprise, it's in the presentation tonight. That's my metro pass, and that's the street that I lived on in Paris. You know, but I was investigating the city, not only the famous places, but also the dark corners and the quiet streets, and what makes this great city such a wonderful place. And realized that infrastructure was the key, and infrastructure is not only the way that the mechanism for which we move from point A to point B or convey water or sewer or electricity. It's the foundation of our economy. It's the foundation of our cultural and social life. And it really matters to the way that we live and our quality of life. And so that was really cool. I would, in particular in Paris, fascinated with the role of the grand boulevards. These are the big boulevards that cross Paris. They were built at the hands of Baron Haussmann in the 1850s and 60s. He plowed them through the medieval city. You can see the Avenue de l'Opéra there being plowed through the medieval city. It came at great social cost to the people who lived there, the communities and livelihoods, their businesses, but also came at a great social benefit. It brought water and sewer. It brought public spaces. It brought fountains and trees. It brought paved roads for the movement of wheeled carts and wagons. Eventually it brought electric street lighting and subways. And what you see, the physical space of that, you know, you think it's a street, but it's really an infrastructure system around which not only the image and the functionality of the city works, but its cultural identity. This is Camille Pissarro, one of the great Impressionist painters who was literally painting the new light that was streaming down into the city as a result of these grand boulevards. And that infrastructure basically became the iconic image of Paris that created this cafe culture and its arts economy and really made it into the economic, social, cultural, military sort of powerhouse that it is today, which is pretty amazing. And what was clear was that when Haussmann was doing that, what Paris was doing was they were building more than just infrastructure. They were building a whole new way of life for people. And it lifted people to economic prosperity and health. And it did all kinds of other improvements to the city, like I said. And you know, that's true of Paris, but it's true of most of the world. And in Georgia, where I live, you know, Georgia was opened up by rail all throughout, and you can see in Alabama the same. When you could take the train anywhere in the state you wanted to go, anywhere in the country. And when you got there, you could get anywhere in the city you wanted to go. Atlanta had 300 miles of hard track trolley. They were all gone by 1949, but this is how we used to live. Those trolleys were literally opened up new territory for the development of some of Atlanta's most cherished neighborhoods today. That's the reason those places exist. It was the infrastructure that created them. And that was what allowed Atlanta to expand in the turn of the century in the early 1900s. And you know, did I go backwards? Atlanta's not alone. There's Huntsville. when early trolleys, older cities, the older parts of older cities, that's how they were built. This is Toronto, bigger cities created this way. This is Detroit. It wasn't always about automobiles. It was also about trolleys and horses and all kinds of other things. That we used to build cities in a very robust kind of way with multiple means of getting around, with dimensions that support walking, all those things. And we created infrastructure to support a new economy and a new way of life, and including the industrialization, and all the big, great industrial cities of this country were built with a new kind of infrastructure. And in that process, we were building not just infrastructure, we were building a whole new way of life for ourselves, creating a new economy and new businesses and all of that. Of course, the cities at that time had challenges. This is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland on fire, which happened multiple times in the 20th century. This is tenement life in New York City, overcrowded, unsanitary conditions for a lot of housing. This is our mayor in Atlanta, Hartsfield, in a slum that would later be cleared through urban renewal, called Buttermilk Bottom. And because cities were very different places at those times, with lots of social unrest and pollution and crime and other kinds of things, we started shifting our sights on something new. We wanted to build a new way of living. We tried to get away from cities and find some peace and quiet, some healthy, fresh air out in the countryside. And so we started to build, with the advent of automobiles, really start to imagine something new for our lives. And we built new highways, new infrastructure to support that way of life. And it did. It created a whole new way of life for people. Now, that way of life was not available to everyone. It was only available to certain people who were privileged in that way and were able to get the FHA loans and buy cars and all of that. But it did support a new way of life, and through the advancement of civil rights, ultimately, urban sprawl became available to everyone. And it's a great story. This is my grandmother, my uncle here's mother, also my father's mother, in Alexandria, Louisiana, holding my aunt as a baby. She met this banker in downtown Alexandria, and his boss convinced him to buy a house out on the edge of town, in one of these Levittown-style neighborhoods that was built out to support the growth of the city. And there they were, and they rented rooms to servicemen in World War II, sort of classic American story of the early stages of automobile-oriented suburbanization. And at that time, we were really innovating in automobile industry, obviously, technology and the business of driving, but we were also innovating in the infrastructure to support that driving. If we hadn't built highways and big roadways, cars wouldn't have been as useful. And so we did that, we innovated. And actually, when I was driving in earlier today and got on Memorial Parkway, I'm really convinced that in 1960, in Traffic Engineer magazine somewhere, there's this whole story about Memorial Parkway and what an innovation it was, because it seems like it was sort of part of a vintage, sort of another time, a sort of early automobile industry innovation that really opened up the valley for the growth of Huntsville. It was pretty fascinating. For infrastructure geeks like me, you gotta understand. Anyway, we didn't realize that we were building the foundation of urban sprawl at that time. We didn't call it the sprawl, we called it the future, and it was. And it's important to put in historical context that in that early stages of suburbanization and the excitement around the future that automobiles provided and the infrastructure to support them, there were a lot of other things happening. There were similarly innovative. People here from Huntsville apparently were really helping send people to the moon. The sexual revolution was breaking down barriers, and the civil rights movement was beginning the march toward the fulfillment of our nation's promise. These things were happening all together, and it was a very forward-looking and visionary sort of point in our history. And automobile growth and the urban growth at that time was really a part of that. It's what drove me, or my family, my parents, to bring us as babies, also or children from Louisiana to Chamblee, a suburb of Atlanta, in 1974. I was 2 years old when we moved. We bought a house in a neighborhood that was incentivized by the construction of 285, our perimeter highway. My dad took a job at an engineering firm designing pump stations and wastewater treatment plants to support the sprawling economy. Literally, the construction of the highways was creating a growth opportunity for business and development that was supporting my family and lifted millions of Americans to economic prosperity here in Huntsville and across the United States. And that was sort of part of our story there too. And again, we didn't know what we were creating. We didn't know where this was all headed. But we were, it was innovation at that time, and we built a whole new way of life for ourselves that has resulted in something maybe that we weren't quite imagining or desiring to end up with. But we were building, in that process, we were building more than infrastructure. We were building a whole new way of life for ourselves, and we were. Of course, those of you who are familiar with Atlanta, the open road is no longer that open. This is the view for a lot of people. And it's not exactly the most desirable thing you want to see every day. And that car dependency, the infrastructure to support car dependency and the growth that's sort of really dependent on cars to get around caused a lot of challenges for the cities, as we've seen in very classic stories like Detroit and the depopulation of most urban cores across the country. But also in suburban areas. This is the shopping center where I grew up. When I was a kid, it was full of national brand stores. Today, it's essentially empty, sort of left behind in the wake of sprawl, and it's really sad to see. And so it's created, there's the environmental challenges, the ecological, there's the economic and the social dislocation, which I think really gets into our politics. And it's changed us, And so, those changes are starting to shift what we want, what our expectations are for the future. And when you see the revitalization of most urban communities across the country, and I saw a lot of it here in Huntsville today, people are changing what they want, and it's changing the infrastructure that they're asking for. And I think that's the sort of context within which the Beltline came to life. So I'll share with you a little bit about that. There's that picture again. So I graduated in 1999, and the idea with the Atlanta BeltLine project is that I was really enamored with this Dutch architect named Rem Koolhaas, who wrote a lot about Atlanta. Most people would read it as very negative, fractured, sprawling, traffic congested area. But I took from it something different, and that's basically that as we start to solve the problems that we've created, we have a pretty good opportunity to make Atlanta into a pretty interesting place to live. It's never going to be Paris, but it's going to be something maybe equally interesting, but in a completely different kind of way. And I thought that was pretty inspiring to say, look at all our problems that we created. We could mope about it, or we could imagine that they are the best assets that we have for the transformation of our communities into something better. And it's pretty crazy that they are, and that's what's happening. So a little background for the Beltline project. This is a loop of old railroads that circle downtown Atlanta. It's 22 miles long. It's actually 4 different railroads that roughly line up to form a loop, 2 to 4 miles out from downtown in every direction. So fairly close in, but not immediately downtown. 45 neighborhoods along the way. And because these were, Atlanta was formed by railroads riding the ridges into the middle of downtown. These railroads were built after the Civil War as the city was growing again, pushing the industry out of the central business district. So these railroad companies after the Civil War built this loop of railroads out in the country at the time, and the industry moved out there. As the city grew, it jumped across that band and went further. So we have this industrial belt around the city that's 22 miles long. About 4,000 to 6,000 acres of industrial land that followed that. So the old factories and industrial properties that followed that used to use the railroad. Of course, when people shifted away from trolleys, industry also shifted towards trucks and away from trains, leaving behind over time these railroads to sort of urban decay. And everybody sort of moved out of town. So here's the Beltline in Atlanta. I know it's kind of fuzzy and hard to see, but this is downtown. If you're familiar at all with Atlanta, downtown in the middle, Midtown. Buckhead is far to the north, so we're fairly close into the region. Just for you guys tonight, there's the Beltline in Huntsville. So you can see the Arsenal out here. So it's fairly close in around downtown. Most of it looks like this, although this doesn't even look like this today because it's been started under construction. But this is, you know, an abandoned railroad that goes through otherwise ordinary sort of industrial properties. But some really great redevelopment sites, views of the city, so a real kind of beauty in a sort of industrial, different kind of way. A lot of backsides. This is Piedmont Hospital, which backed its parking garage up to the corridor. You can see the proximity to downtown, so that's it in pink in the foreground. You see the Sears building here, the big red brick building. That's the old Sears and Roebuck distribution building, the largest building in the southeastern United States. It's almost twice as big as those skyscrapers downtown, and it's being redeveloped right now. And you can ride your bike directly into the building. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But this is a great diagram where you get the abandoned railroad in the middle, flanked on either side by the obsolete industrial land. And on either side of that are these neighborhoods that Atlanta really loves about itself. In this case, the West End on the right and Oakland City on the left. This is the cutting across here, the South MARTA line that takes you from downtown to the airport. So I graduated in '99, never imagined we would actually build it. I went to work for an architecture firm. We did mixed-use urban infill projects. So the city was growing. Developers were coming into the city, buying industrial tracts of land, rezoning them, and building medium-density kind of mixed-use redevelopment projects. A lot of them happened to be along this railroad corridor. And we were working on one site in particular, a 20-acre site that was going to nearly double the population of the adjacent neighborhood, historic neighborhood. And we were trying to decide, do you take the parking garage and jam it up against the abandoned railroad, or do you orient the project toward the railroad, hoping it would become something better one day? And I was telling my coworkers about this idea I had in school. And they thought it was cool because they lived in some of the neighborhoods nearby, and we were doing a lot of work in that corridor. And they thought, wow, let's see if we can get any interest in it. And so we started talking to people. And the more people we talked to, the more people wanted to hear about it. Eventually, this is the summer of 2001, we mailed out a letter with some maps to everybody we could think of, the governor, the mayor, all the regional planning agencies. And we got some nice letters back saying, nice idea, good luck with that. But we got a great response from one woman, she's on city council, chair of the transportation committee for the city. And I don't know if you know, but the city of Atlanta is only 1/10 of the regional population, so it's impossible to sort of shape urban growth policy. But she was interested in public transportation in the city. And she had called all these planners in, the Georgia DOT, MARTA, or Transit Authority, all the regional players, and said, what are you doing for the city of Atlanta in terms of public transportation? And they were all talking about moving people from way outside of town into downtown and back home at the end of the day, not really for people who live in the city, who are more likely to want transit, more likely to ride transit, more willing to pay for transit, have been paying for transit for 30 years through MARTA, and a large proportion of people who are dependent on transit to get around because they can't afford a car. There really wasn't anything in any of those plans for those people. And so she was frustrated, and she went back to her office. Literally that day, this letter was on her desk. And she thought, wow, this is for people in the city. This is what I'm looking for. So she called us in. We told her more about the project. And she said, well, let's see what happens. And so she had a town hall meeting in a church basement in Virginia Highland. And she had the same players come in and do their regional proposals. And then we came into the end with the whole slide carousel from my thesis images and my old tattered map and said, hey, what do you think about this? And the neighborhood fell in love with the idea. And they thought it was great. And a couple months later, she was elected. We did a couple more meetings, and she was elected city council president. And we took that conversation citywide. And for 2.5 years, we were meeting with every neighborhood group, every church group, school, Rotary Club, business, anybody who wanted to talk to us, we would meet with them. Literally, I was doing 3 and 4 public meetings a week for 2.5 years, and so was she, and so was her staff, and a handful of volunteers. And we created this amazing grassroots movement of public support for the project that got the attention of the mayor and the other elected officials. It got the attention of the regional planners, and the whole thing started to come into place and sort of take on a life of its own. And the fact that the people really fell in love with this is really what started to change the politics and make the whole thing really possible. And we started that conversation. We had 3 core constituencies, and it's hard to read this, but the first were community people, people who were living in these communities, trying to make them a better place, and they saw this as a vehicle to sort of take them there, to get them there. The second were developers who saw the opportunity to take advantage of the growth in the city, organize that growth, build excitement around it, and make a buck. And the third were environmental groups, which I sort of use loosely term to say issue-oriented nonprofit organizations that were interested in the built environment. So everything from advocacy around trees to parks to trails and pedestrians, bicycles, housing or whatever. And it was crazy to have all those people at the same table wanting the same outcome. You know, if you're in this world, you know how impossible that is, but there we are. There we were, and it created all these other kinds of conversations with people, made all kinds of other things possible, and the idea started to grow. So the idea with is, and I guess I forgot to say, is to take that loop of old railroads, that 22-mile loop, and transform it into a transit greenway, a 22-mile loop of light rail or streetcar type transit, and a multi-use trail for the full 22-mile loops. The transit connects to MARTA at each of the 4 compass points. The trail connects to an emerging regional trail network that will get you all the way to Alabama via the Silver Comet Trail, which is pretty amazing. And the second part was economic development. So for the communities in the east and north that were already experiencing growth, they saw it as a way to manage their quality of life in the face of new density and traffic. In the neighborhoods to the south and west that hadn't seen any new investment in the last 40 years, it was a way to attract that kind of growth and development to those communities. And then the last was green space, connecting about 700 acres of existing green space, including our big signature park, Piedmont Park, which you may be more familiar with, to all kinds of neighborhood parks, also cultural and historic destinations like the Botanical Gardens, the zoo, the Jimmy Carter Library, those kinds of things. And that was the core proposal that we went around talking to people about. What was amazing is that the further we went down the road, the bigger the idea got. So by 2004, the Trust for Public Land got on board and said, that's cute that you guys want to do 700 acres connect 700 acres of parks, but what about we carve 1,400 acres of this industrial land and make all of that into parks, including this quarry up on the top, which will be the city's largest park, about 350 acres, which will be pretty amazing. Mayor Franklin at that time said, what better place to put affordable housing than on a transit line where people can afford not to have a car? And so now it's the largest affordable housing initiative the city's ever undertaken. That's all great for new housing, but what about people, especially on lower and fixed income, who live in these communities now? How can we make sure that they can stay in the face of rising rents and taxes? And so now we've started to put in place some community stabilization policies, which is pretty great and important. Public art community came on board, said, great place for public art. The historic preservation folks said, Atlanta's a railroad town. This is sort of our waterfront, this industrial railroad corridor. How can we celebrate that in this process? Trees Atlanta is a local nonprofit that is trying to restore the tree canopy. They wanted to make a 22-mile linear arboretum. Public health folks at Georgia Tech and at Emory know that communities that have access to transit and trails are healthier because people have access to walking and trails and improved physical activity, reduced obesity, diabetes, heart disease, those kinds of things. And so they're measuring that. They did a health impact assessment in 2007 and are continuing to monitor that as a model. Brownfield remediation, these are old industrial sites, a lot of old sites that have contamination. This attracts the private market to solve that problem. And for problems that are too big, it attracts the regulatory agencies. We'll talk more about that. And then, the improved public realm. We'll talk about that. And, the idea continues to expand. There's a woman who wants to make it into a 22-mile food forest where you can pick berries and herbs along the way. There's the Bocce Ball Court Association wants to put bocce ball courts all along the way, the farmers markets along the way. So it's sort of captured, because people own it, they feel an authorship to it, and they can make it their own and make it into what they want. And that makes it, pretty awesome and fun. This will describe to you how it works basically at a local level. This is a neighborhood in southwest Atlanta called Capitol View Manor. There's the railroad in red, and the yellow is the old industrial obsolete land, plus some, in this community, obsolete kind of commercial properties. You can see how the railroad existed before the neighborhood, so you have oftentimes very different neighborhoods on one side of the tracks to the other, and literally the other side of the tracks often differentiated by socioeconomic differences. But it creates this industrial sort of swath of land between the two. So you take the old railroad and you make it into a transit greenway, transit and trails. You take adjacent city-owned property where it's logical, and other spur railroads and connect other trails to other communities and new parks. Infill houses on infill development on vacant property, the extension of streets across the railroad, across the industrial property so that people can get to the Beltline from the community there, but also to create the walkable scale urban blocks that we're imagining. Each of those blocks could accommodate the Empire State Building. It probably won't be that, but it'll be, the idea is to infill that with, compatible mixed use development that's compatible with the neighborhood, but also meets the land values and transit ridership. I could bore you to death with all the plans that have had to take place in the last 15 years to make this thing come to life. I won't, but suffice it to say that there's plenty of them. It's a huge effort, and Dennis was a part of that as a consultant and part of it as a community person, and it really was built from the ground up in that way. The most significant to date has been the tax allocation district. It's a tax increment finance district. It's the first major source of public money going to the project. It basically leverages property taxes for the project. So if you own a property and you pay taxes on it, if you redevelop your property is more valuable. So naturally you're paying in more in taxes. So it captures that incremental increase for a period of 25 years to pay for the project, and it'll generate about $1.5 billion to help fund the project. That created the Atlanta BeltLine Inc., which is the implementing agency. So it's a spinoff of the economic development arm of the city. They have their own board, the mayor's on the board, and their charge is to take all the money from all the different various sources and build the project. There's also the Atlanta BeltLine Partnership, which is the nonprofit partner. They do private capital campaign fundraising from philanthropic, I can't say that word, philanthropic sources, corporate giving, those kinds of things, on behalf of primarily trails and greenways, parks. We do bus tours. If you're ever in town and you want to do a bus tour, we do them every Friday and Saturday for the last 8 years. We've taken thousands of people out. You have to sign up about a couple months in advance, but you should plan ahead and do that. It's a great way to see the city. Also 5K runs and other kinds of events to sort of build awareness around the project and build, sort of keep the conscience of the project, especially around the softer side, social kinds of issues around affordability and equity in terms of implementation. It's a big mess, basically. There's all kinds of people involved, every organization you can imagine. Those two organizations at its core, but they're leveraging the public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector to sort of implement this project. It is truly an unprecedented sort of effort on the part of lots of people. There are a lot of pretty pictures. I used to work at a firm called Perkins & Will. We did a lot of the design work for the project, did drawings of what it will look like one day. But more importantly, we're actually building it. It's happening. It is generating development interest. This is the backside of the old Sears building, which is now almost the front. This is about a year ago, and now this is a big, beautiful courtyard. The retail is starting to open. It's 2 million square feet. It'll be retail, housing, office. Their office is moving in from 20 miles out in the suburbs, tech firms that want to be here. And the reason they always say is because this is where our employees want to live. Young, tech-savvy people who are not interested in sitting in traffic. This is where they're moving. They're moving to these communities, and they can ride their bikes here or walk directly from the corridor, and so that's a big plus. And if you're in Atlanta next time, the food hall is opening, dozens of restaurants, and there's a rooftop with putt-putt and all kinds of stuff. It's crazy. It's a real big deal. So that's the development is generating increment in the tax district. The increment is then being used to make public improvements and to build the project itself, not only the corridor, but new parks. This is a new park called Historic Fourth Ward Park. It is, in addition to being a park, it's a stormwater facility. It actually protects the Sears building from flooding and has generated a tremendous amount of development around it. It saved the taxpayers money by building a park instead of an underground storage tank, which is another whole story in itself. We're also using the money to buy land for the trail and the corridor for the transit and for parks. So this is, when we get a piece of the railroad, we go ahead and open it up for interim uses for hiking and mountain biking, and we're building permanent trails. This is the East Side Trail, real signature part of what's built right now is the East Side Trail, 2 miles on the east side, and we'll talk about that. New parks, this is a skate park, the city's first skate park, but also renovated and expanded existing city parks. The streetcar is, a first section of streetcars opened downtown late last year. The next phase of construction will come out to the Beltline corridor, and then it'll start sort of going up into the corridor. So we're sort of got phase 1 done, but we're working on what's next. You could learn more than you ever imagined or wanted to know about how it's going to be implemented over the next 30 years through the strategic implementation plan, which is all online. But for example, this is all mapped out until the year 2031, which is the end of our tax district, which is when it's supposed to be finished. The orange, for example, is transit. So you can see we're not spending a lot of money on transit right now, but in the next few years, we definitely will be investing there. But we're still in the early stages of implementation. This is where we are. The blue line is what's built, so this is the east side. That's where you really need to go if you go visit today. The black is under construction, so the east side extension is just about to start, and the west side broke ground last November and has another year and a half or so for build out. But it's working. It's doing everything we always said it would do, especially in regard to economics. We've spent about $400 million to date for land acquisition, for parks and trails, construction of parks and trails, all the planning and all the stuff that has to go into it. In the same time period, $400 million is invested. We've seen $2.4 billion in private sector development as a direct result in the same area. Pretty amazing 6-to-1 return on our investment. Makes me think that we should be just sort of putting the pedal down and doubling down on it, and hopefully we will. But it's cool to see the city come to life as a result. A lot of new people, new businesses, jobs, stores. There's a hotel around the corner from my house that's about to start construction. It's cool to see these old neighborhoods really coming back to life. And it looks like this. And it's important to remember, you know, in this process, we're not just building a new kind of infrastructure for ourselves. We're building a whole new way of life for ourselves and for our family. And that gets me to this larger sort of story. And I meant to mention that we're going to have a Q&A afterwards, so if you have questions, definitely hold on to them. I'll be around to answer them formally here, but also I can stay a little after if you have questions after that. I want to connect the Beltline to a much larger movement. I was really interested as we started to make progress and this thing got off the ground and this sort of started to develop a life of its own. You know, what are lessons from this that can be applied to other cities, other places, but also what are other cities doing that are equally transformational? And you don't have to look very far to see that this kind of cultural momentum, this shift in what people want and where the city is going, is happening everywhere, around the country and around the world. And I'll share a little bit about that. It's this idea, I like this term, infraculture, but it's about sort of the cultural side of infrastructure. What does it mean? How does it changing the way that we live? When I was in Paris that year abroad, I lived about a block from this thing, an abandoned railroad, elevated railroad viaduct that went for several miles from the center city out to the east. I walked underneath it every time I had to go to the grocery store or the laundromat, but honestly, I didn't give it really much of a thought at all. I went back a couple years later and had been transformed into the Viaduc des Arts. All the spaces below had been converted into studios and businesses that support the arts. Really beautiful transformation. And up top was something even more crazy, a linear park through the city. And it really changes the way that you see the city of Paris and from a third-story vantage point. And that really got me thinking about this notion repurposing old infrastructure for some new kind of thing. And again, because of our story in Atlanta and my story as a part of it, I've had the opportunity to go around and share this with cities all over the country and a few places around the world. And while I'm there, I meet with people who are working the ground game in their cities and see all these other amazing things happening. So I'll share some of them. Some of them, if you sort of sprinkled them around on a sheet of paper, they would look like that. That's the Beltline at the top left. But that long blue line over there, you'll see in a minute, is the Los Angeles River. So they range in scale pretty dramatically. I didn't know when I was in Paris that there was also a Beltline in Paris, and they also have a similar kind of idea. It won't be quite as comprehensive as ours in Atlanta because they have some technical sort of challenges and some discontinuities. But they're making up for that by just going ahead and building it. This is the new tram that's built on the south side. And this is in New York. This is the High Line. Has anybody seen the High Line in New York? Very beautiful, very small, but equally sort of transformational. Has grassroots story and origin. A couple guys just thought, hey, what if we saved that old elevated railroad? And it's really transformed the west side of Manhattan. Beautiful, really beautiful thing. This is up top, linear garden, about 1.5 miles through the sky, through Chelsea and Hell's Kitchen. This is I'll go through these quickly. This is in Cleveland. This is the Detroit Superior Bridge. It's a double-decker bridge. They're reimagining the middle layer there where the trolleys used to be. This is in Chicago, the 606 elevated railroad for about 3 miles through Wicker Park and Bucktown. This just opened actually last summer. This is an old picture of what it before condition. I haven't seen the built one version yet, but a 3-mile bikeway across the city. This is in Philadelphia, about 3 miles. The first mile is in this spectacular tunnel. The second is open to the sky but below street level, and the third one launches out over the city on a viaduct. This is in Singapore. I saw this last March. I went down there. They've got a 15-mile abandoned railroad across their whole country island, and they've been following the Beltline in Atlanta for 5 years. They see it as a model for what they want to do. And it's a greenway, they're imagining as a greenway and all that, but their number one goal is community transformation. How can we make this a great asset for communities? How can we drive sort of a community life around this corridor? That's their number one goal, which is pretty amazing and very cool. This is a Katy Trail in Dallas. The Arbutus corridor in Vancouver, they're just imagining what they might do with this old railroad. In Toronto, it runs alongside a railroad, but it's really a power line easement, and they're imagining what they might do with this. It's called the Green Line, and they've had some design competitions, made some really interesting kind of progress. In New Orleans, this is the Lafitte Greenway, a great infrastructure story for geeks like me. At first, it was a portage route between the Bayou St. Jean and the French Quarter. It's how they got their goods and services into the French Quarter. Then it was a canal that did the same thing. Then it was a railroad, and then it was abandoned in the 30s, and now it's a greenway, and it goes through Treme, and this was under construction this last year. It's open now and all green, really beautiful infrastructure for community revitalization. In Minneapolis, this is a Midtown Greenway, like the Beltline, a railroad corridor that will be both transit and trail. They've built the trail. The transit is in the future, but that was our early model because there weren't, at the time we were getting off the ground, there weren't really any other models. I found another one in Detroit. This is the DeQuinder Cut. Similarly, old railroad sunken below street grade, trail is built, future transit. In Salt Lake City, they've built the transit, the first one of this type that actually has the train running by. That's basically what the Beltline will look like in the future. In Miami, they've got an elevated transit line, and they're reimagining the space below it as a linear park, and they've got some of the best landscape architects in the country redesigning this park right now. In Houston, though, beyond transit and beyond railroads, this is a degraded sort of waterway. So the same thing that happened to railroads where they got industrial sort of corridors, waterways often in urban areas are degraded, streamlined by engineers over time to sort of for flood control measures and sort of forgotten as a public space. The bayous that drain Houston, especially Buffalo Bayou, were reimagined as a new community park and corridor. It's a spectacular transformation and has all the similar components of wildlife habitat and public art and economic development and community stabilization and all of those same kinds of things. And this has actually been exported to the other 10 bayous that drain the region, and the voters there approved a $100 million referendum a couple years ago that will go towards that, which is pretty cool. My big obsession, though, is the LA River. Who even knew LA had a river? You've seen it in every post-apocalyptic movie coming out of Hollywood, the Terminator and all that. It's a 51-mile concrete channel through LA, but there's been a grassroots movement since the 80s to find some new purpose for it again. And they've made a ton of progress in the last 10 years especially. The mayor has been out there kayaking in the river. They have the Army Corps of Engineers, who channelized it originally in the 30s, has now agreed to a $1 billion restoration of the Glendale Narrows, where they're starting to, it'll never be a wild river again, but they're imagining how they can add green trees and greenways and trails and things to make it something that people would actually want to be near and live near. And like the Beltline, and all these other projects, really changing not only the physical form of the city, but changing the way that we think about the places that we live and their cultural expectations for them, which is pretty cool. One of the coolest things about the Beltline is that, you know, I live in the city right on the Beltline, and people from all over the region, they come and they park on my street, and you can tell because there are license plates and say the county name on it. And I think it's cool because they're coming into the city, they're changing their view of the city, what their expectations are for the city, which they probably had some stereotypes about what that might be like. And they're changing that, but they're also taking those ideas home and planting them there. And I think rethinking what Atlanta is, you hear all the time from young people especially, that the Beltline is the reason that they are staying there, or the reason that they moved there, because they imagine the city is becoming something that will be a place that they want to live and raise a family, and that makes it really rewarding. But all these projects have that kind of quality, where it's more than just sort of moving things around, infrastructure, wonky stuff. It's also about our lives, and it makes our lives interesting and worthwhile. This is the East River Blueway in New York. It's just a concept right now, but it basically embraces the elevated FDR highway along the East River. It doesn't get rid of it, but imagines what it would be like if you had an infrastructure that allowed cars, but also imagined a real waterfront, esplanade, and bikeways, and greenways, and marshes, and fishing, and kayaking in the East River. Pretty amazing, and also goes into sort of climate resiliency. This is the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto. In Memphis, this cool project where this railroad bridge over the Mississippi River was built originally with a roadway cantilevered off the side of it. But when they built the new roadway bridge separate, they abandoned the roadway off on the railroad. And so now they're going to take this old roadbed, which the road itself is gone, but the structure is there, and make it into this beautiful bikeway over the Mississippi River. It's astonishing when you're out there on it. But even much more simpler sort of projects. This is in Indianapolis, where in their downtown area, they built a project called the Cultural Trail. They just took lanes of these overbuilt roadways that were all downtown, where you've got 6 lanes of traffic, where you really only need like 3 or 4 lanes for cars. And they used all that extra space to build this really highly recognizable branded trail that loops around downtown. It connects their cultural institutions, and then it branches out to some of the other neighborhoods just outside of downtown. Pretty cool and amazingly successful from an economic and cultural perspective. And again, you know, all these projects are sort of building more than just infrastructure. They're building a whole new way of life for us. What I've done is I've got this database of all these projects, a few dozen of them that I'm tracking, and of course every city I go to there's something new, and then extracting some lessons from them. What is it about these projects that makes them special? Which ones work and why? What are the best sort of lessons from them? So I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, but you'll get the point. The first one is that they think big. The bigger the better. The Beltline started as a kernel of an idea, but it grew. And every time it grew, it not only became a better project, it brought in more constituencies. More people liked it for the same reason. I mean, for different reasons. So some people like it for transit, some people like it for trails, some people for economic development, all kinds of reasons. Whatever way or interest you have in the project, you see yourself as part of something bigger that's going to make the city better as a whole. And that bigness actually made the project more, I don't say easy, because it wasn't nothing but easy, but it became sort of developed a life of its own. The second is that they include everyone, and they cultivate this sort of co-ownership, that all those people are part of it, that diversity matters, that the diversity of the community is represented, not only at the end, not only at the community engagement meetings, but from the very beginning, in the sort of very origin of the idea in the Beltline project. Communities of all kinds around the city really embraced it from the beginning, and especially for low-income communities, because they were at the table, because they wanted it as much as everybody else. Their voice was heard from the beginning. So now, when we look at affordability challenges, we really can't call the project successful if it doesn't include them, and that's such an important thing as we go through implementation. And so, for whatever reason people come there, that they're included in that vision. The other thing that I think is amazing about these projects is they really promote sort of the authenticity of a place. Atlanta's a railroad town, and here we are repurposing these railroads to create a new future for the city, which is really kind of powerful. In Los Angeles, the river is why the city exists. That's why the city was built on that river, and it nurtured the early cultural and economic life of the city. But then it was forgotten. But now they're repurposing this river as a real, true signature of what the future of the Los Angeles region is going to be about. That's pretty cool. So while automobiles and sprawl kind of make everything look kind of the same, these projects really promote the sort of specialness of a place. They connect people back to the history and the climate and the culture of a place that's really meaningful and reminds us why we like and fall in love with the places that we live. The third is compelling change. The projects themselves are not the change. Obviously, we're changing an old railroad into a transit greenway and all of that. But the real point of the project is not the thing itself, it's the life that it generates. So we're compelling new businesses to open up, compelling people to go for a walk after work. You're compelling people to change their lives, and that's what actually makes the place interesting, not the thing itself. Inspire life, design matters. The design of these places matter, and the details count, and design can hurt you as much as it helps you. And so thoughtfulness in that regard really matters. Stay focused, that these projects, the best ones, really stay focused on the end goal. And they don't shoot themselves in the, they don't start with the budget, and they don't start with the politics. They don't start with the naysayers saying you can't do that ever because of X. They start with, where do we want to live? What kind of place do we want to live when we grow up? And then let's start to put the tools in place to create that place. And the funding and the politics will follow if it's the right vision and if people really believe in it. These projects emphasize people not only in the beginning, but throughout implementation, that the voice that made these projects possible in the first place, the best ones really carry through and through the planning, design, construction, because at the end of the day, again, it's the people that make the projects work at the end and worthwhile. And the last, they band together. All these projects are big, messy. Don't be afraid of all the different organizations that are going to have to get on board with something. If it's the right idea and if the community really wants it, everybody sort of comes around and starts to believe in something and work together through these new partnerships. I'll end with a few slides about why all this matters, and not to be sort of cheesy, but there's my kids, and it matters for them. And really, because, like I said, I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta. I grew up with, if you're familiar with Atlanta, I-285. That's where I grew up, on I-285. We would grow from the mall, to church and back and forth, my dad's office and home. And, that's sort of where our world was. And, no judgment. I mean, it's not right or wrong. That's just the way it was. And my worldview was really shaped by that. And my cultural expectations for what a city was and what the places that we build are as a planner was really shaped by that worldview. And so it's really cool to see my kids' worldview being shaped by the Atlanta BeltLine project, and for them to have an expectation that where they live, they can ride their bikes to the grocery store or to school, that they can go visit a friend, that they can go out on this thing. And so to see their worldviews sort of being shaped by that gives you hope that we might actually solve all the much bigger, sort of more daunting challenges that we face. And so that's why it matters. It's cool to see that cultural interpretation of the project come to life as other people are sort of looking at it. And so when the New York Times came to town a while ago to write this story, you know, they talked about the metrics of the project, 22 miles, transit trail, blah, blah, blah. But what they were really writing about is what it was doing to the city, how it was changing the way that we lived and making Atlanta into a more attractive place, especially for young people. And, you know, I don't usually walk down the Beltline playing my violin, tugging my dog on the back of a cooler, but this lady does. She's out there a lot, and she contributes something to it. This is that life that sort of compelling, you know, it makes life interesting, and she's really pretty amazing. And so while I do, you know, while I get to come here and all over, travel around the country talking about this project, I also live on it. This is me giving my daughter's Girl Scout troop a bike ride for their troop. They got a badge for that. This is my morning commute. There's my dog's last walk. You know, this is life, you know. When y'all were making fun of us, or maybe, did y'all have a snowpocalypse too? I was just fine, you know. I was learning how ice really jams up your fenders. That was my big lesson for the day. But it's cool to see the project, you know, come to life and that people are really out there enjoying it. Yeah, they're commuting and they're out there getting exercise, but they're also out there on dates, and they're out there to have a good time and to meet friends and to go to school and do all kinds of other things. It's fun to watch people out there in every season of the day. And so here's my daughter on the right. You know, you imagine that this is her worldview. This is what's shaping her world about how not just a passive sort of recreational trail, but actually how we go places. We went to Home Depot the other day like this. I actually bought a stick of lumber and put on my bike, but that's another story. But you know, other people see it through their own lens. And my favorite, my mentor, one of my favorite people in the country really is Dr. Dick Jackson. He used to direct the Center for Environmental Health at CDC. He lived in Atlanta at that time, now teaches at UCLA. And his story is that, you know, the Beltline is doing more for public health than any prescription that he can write, because it's getting people out there and making them active. It's reducing environmental contaminants. It's improving air quality. It's changing growth patterns. It's making people less dependent on cars. All the kinds of things that really contribute to health. It's invigorating the economy, which has clear impacts on health, especially for children. So that's pretty cool to watch. Another sort of cool thing is this woman. This is Ivy Knight. I met her about a year and a half ago, maybe, on the unbuilt section of the Beltline down here in Southwest Atlanta. She thought the Beltline was cool. She liked the 22-mile transit and trail and all that stuff, but that really wasn't her focus. What she was really excited about was the economy that it was going to bring to her community. She's a new fashion designer. She started her own company. That's her photographer in the background with her models doing a fashion shoot inside the beautiful old tunnel. And she was excited that it was going to bring an economy to support her business, which in turn was going to support her family and her life, which is really cool. And when US DOT Secretary Anthony Foxx came to Atlanta about a year ago, in the same vein of thought, he didn't call the Beltline a great way to move from point A to point B. He called it a ladder of opportunity, a game changer for the city, that it was going to really create opportunities for economic prosperity for people like Ivy Knight, which is really cool. This is the Atlanta BeltLine Lantern Parade. Has anybody been to the Lantern Parade by chance? Am I the only one? I guess so. So this is an event, really, that started as part of an ongoing sort of annual thing called Art on the Beltline. But it was put on by a woman from New Orleans who imagined parades as something that you participate in, not something you watch. And this idea of a lantern parade where you make your own homemade lantern and you walk down the East Side Trail. And it sounded like a lot of fun. And so the first year, there were about 200 people. And the second year, there were about 400 people. And the third year, there were about 800 people. and the third year or fourth year there were 1,200 people. The fifth year, the next year there were 12,000 people. And the next year there were 22,000 people. And last 2 weeks ago, there were 66,000 people out there on the Beltline. And so it's amazing to see that cultural life come up in the city. And literally tens of thousands of people and kids with homemade lanterns walking down the street, walking down the Beltline, so the infrastructure, the Beltline is the infrastructure for this new cultural life that we didn't even know we had in us, and it brought something out of us. And it couldn't have happened without the Beltline. We wouldn't have done this in any other space. And it's become this enormous sort of thing, which is really transformational in the city. It's, they said now the largest, even before this year, the largest lantern parade in North America, which I didn't know there was really such a thing, but that sounds cool. But what's cool about that is it's a different kind of example for what the EPA is interested in. The EPA is really into brownfield land, contamination cleanup for industrial properties. And Gwen Keys-Fleming is from Georgia, and she was in charge of Region 4. She's now the Chief of Staff at EPA in Washington. And so she's very familiar with the Beltline. And when we got the EPA's 2013 Smart Growth Project of the Year, it was because of this perspective that she always talks about, that the Beltline not only cleans up the contaminated industrial land by attracting the private market to do that, but it also transforms that land into something really positive for communities through new parks, through development, which has jobs and housing and all that, and through these kinds of activation, arts and sort of cultural assets. So that's really cool to watch. I will end on these slides, and hopefully you have some questions for me. But this is the Beltline project. This is the Beltline corridor just a few years ago in 2009, abandoned railroad corridor. You can see the Sears building there in the distance. A few years later, after the East Side Trail opened in 2012, and that following spring, I took my kids for a bike ride, and I took this picture. And that's a picture. That's what it looks like. And that's my son up there with the yellow tires, and my daughter's way far ahead because she does that. And I was taking pictures in the back with my phone, trying not to crash. And I saw this, when I got home, I was sort of flipping through my pictures, and I thought, wow, this is the coolest picture that I've taken in 15 years of working on this project. And it's not because it's a beautiful spring day and it was fresh, and the trees were electric green and the sky was blue, and people were literally walking past. You could overhear their conversations talking about how much in love with their city they are again. It wasn't really that. It was this lady right here on the right with the red hair. She's carrying her groceries. And in the process, she's validating everything that we always said the Beltline would do, that it changes the way that people live their lives in Atlanta. This was not really possible that long ago, and now she has this sort of infrastructure of opportunity to change the way that she lives and the way that everybody, and it's amazing now to see how many people are out there carrying their groceries on the Beltline. It's pretty cool to watch. And the project's not even done. This trail is even done. The running shoulder's not built. The landscaping is not in, the signs aren't there, there's no lighting, there's no benches, all the ramps and stairs are not there, not to mention the transit is years away. The development isn't there. Ponce City Market is only now opening, and already in that moment, the project was already generating so much change. And so you can begin to imagine the sort of magnitude of change that we're facing in Atlanta as a result of this project. So it's exciting for me to be a part of it, obviously, and to live it. Also exciting for me to come here and share my story with you. I do want to make a quick plug for my book. I got a book coming out March 16th. It's called Where We Want to Live, and it's about all these topics, and it's a story. It's not too wonky, not too plannerly, but it is a story about what these projects mean and why they matter. It tells a Beltline story, and it connects it to everything else, like I said, so hope you'll take a look at that. Thanks for letting me be a part of the big picture.